Okay. Today we begin a brand new section of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. That's section 37. It's all about Toivelling. So from a large look of everything, we're about to eat, but before we eat, we need to get the food ready. We're preparing our food. So we spoke about separating challah, which is a mitzvah. We spoke about salting meats. And today we speak about Toivelling. Before we eat, we need to make sure that our dishes are actually kosher as well. Even if it's a brand new dish, there's still a step that it needs in order for it to be kosher, kosher meaning fit for use. So let's take a look. So I'll start with a little introduction where we have the concept of Toivelling, of koshering dishes in the Torah. So the Torah tells us, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, take revenge for the children of Israel against the Midianites. Afterwards, you will be gathered to your people. So Hashem actually gives Moshe one of his final instructions and mitzvahs is after the people of Midian had caused the people to sin. So just to give you a little bit of historical context. Just to give you a little bit of historical context, we have the famous story of Bilam and Balak, where Bilam was hired to try to curse the people, and he was unsuccessful at that. But Balak was rather disappointed. But Bilam did finally give him a piece of advice, which unfortunately was effective in them harming the Jewish people. And the piece of advice was that Hashem hates promiscuity. If you could get the daughters of Midian to attract the boys of the Jewish people, then you will be able to cause them to sin and even bring them to serve idols. And unfortunately, that is what happened. The daughters of Midian came out, so they started attracting the Jewish boys. And just before sin, one sin, a terrible sin, another sin, which was also terrible, transpired, where the Midianite girls would say to the guy that if you want to take things to the next level, you need to bow down to this idol. And so through that, the Midianites actually caused the Jewish people not only to be involved in promiscuity, but actually to bow down to idols. And it caused a terrible plague amongst the Jewish people. A lot of people died. And after this whole incident, Hashem gave Moshe a special mitzvah at the time that we actually need to go to war with Midian and we need to destroy them. Because at that point, Midian represented the source of evil. And that's what transpired. So war took place, and then a lot of goods were collected, a lot of booty. And what was to be done with that? So Elazar the Kohen said to the soldiers returning from battle, this is the statute that Hashem has commanded Moshe. This is the law. And he says, only the gold, the silver, the copper, the iron, the tin, and the lead, whatever is used in fire, you shall pass through fire, and then it will be clean. It must, however, also be cleansed with sprinkling water. And whatever is not used in fire, you shall pass through water. So in this little verse here at the bottom, the Torah indicated two steps that need to take place in order for something to become kosher. If you want to, if you're buying something secondhand, if you're buying a secondhand pot or braai or whatever it is, and you want it to become kosher, there's two steps. First, you need to get rid of the non-kosher taste that is inside of it. So if it's something that was used with heat, then it needs to be koshered with heat. If it was something that was only used with cold, then it would only need cold water in order to get any of the non-kosher physical remnants that would linger on in the walls of that dish. However, in addition to purging the non-kosher physical residue or taste, there's also a second step, which is cleanse with sprinkling water. Now, what that means in practical terms today is it means that in addition to koshering, we need to also put things into the mikveh. In a letter, I think it is, the Rebbe describes how this represents Hashem gave us this world and we could use it in order to serve Hashem. And in this process of making the world a vessel to serve Hashem, there's two steps. First of all, we need to get rid of that which is forbidden. So if there's something that actually isn't allowed, we need to make sure to remove that. And the second step is to, by putting it in a mikveh, we're elevating it to a higher level where not only is it not involved in negativity or sin, but it doesn't even relate to it anymore. It's a whole level higher. Or in another explanation, the Arizal explains that everything that was created in the world was created in order for us to use it to serve Hashem. Now, once property enters into the ownership of a Jew, so we put it in mikveh in order to bring the utensil that we're using to an added state of holiness so that it can be an appropriate vessel to be able to make this world more godly and a better place. So that is the spiritual significance of Toivelling. Now let's take a look at the physical, exactly how it's done, what the halachas are. Okay. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch begins when you buy metal or glass utensils that are used for food from a non-Jew, even if they're new. One may not use them until for the purpose of food, even if the food is cold, unless they are immersed in a natural spring or mikveh. So again, even if it's, why does he say even if it's cold? Because generally, let's say you go to a hotel, and in the hotel or you go for drinks, and they pour you a cup of Coke in a glass, and that glass is a non-kosher glass. It's not a kosher place, but you're just having a drink. So there would be no problem. Why? Since what you're drinking is cold, it's cold Coke. So the Coke is not going. It's cold. It's not going to be able to extract. Let's say that glass had previously been placed in a dishwasher, boiling hot water, together with another plate that had pork on it. And when the two were washed together, let's say the taste of pork now entered into the walls of that glass. However, if you're having a cold cup of Coke, so since it's all cold and the glass was washed in between, the Coke is not going to extract any of that pork taste out of the glass unless it's either hot or it sits there for a long time or it's very sharp. So even if it's cold and there's no concern of non-kosher taste, still you wouldn't be allowed to use a glass unless it goes to mikveh. But that is provided that, this is quite an interesting one. It's provided that the glass is owned by a Jew, meaning a transferred ownership. So here's an interesting one. If you go into a hotel that's owned by non-Jews, then there would be nothing wrong with drinking a cup of Coke in a glass, because this halacha, this concept of toivelling only applies to dishes that have entered into the domain of a Jew. As long as it's owned by a non-Jew, then you would be allowed to use it without toivelling it. However, if it was a Jewish-owned hotel, then there would be a requirement for it to be toiveled, and if it wasn't, then you wouldn't be allowed to drink from it, which is quite interesting. So, under practical examples, let's say you go onto Airbnb and you rent an apartment. Okay. If the owner of the apartment is not Jewish, then you could go ahead and use the glasses for cold drinks. But if the owner of the B&B is Jewish and it's not a kosher place, meaning the glasses were never toiveled, then you actually wouldn't be allowed to use those glasses, because as long as it's owned by a Jew, before we use it, we have to first dip it in the mikveh. Now, what kind of body of water? Whatever would qualify for a woman to go to mikveh, that would qualify to toivel the dishes as well. And again, the purpose of this immersion is to elevate these utensils from the impurity of heathen ownership to the holiness of Jewish ownership. So it's about bringing it to a higher level of holiness, where the Jewish people are referred to as the light unto the nations. And we're supposed to be in tune with a higher level of greater presence of Hashem in this world. That's why we don't just have 7 Noahide laws, but we have 613 mitzvahs. And in order for us to be able to achieve what we need to achieve, so these vessels need an upgrade. And that happens when they go to mikveh. Now, before dipping it into the mikveh, you would make a bracha. If you're toiveling one dish, you would say, al tfilas keli. If it's 2 or more, then it would be kelim. If, for example, you go to Kosher World in Glen Hazel, there is the wall, the bracha is written there on the wall. So this is a mitzvah. Now, although I mentioned previously in the slideshow that the Torah clearly spoke about the Jewish people being instructed to toivel the dishes that they rescued from Midian, nevertheless, most authorities agree that it didn't seem to be an instruction, a mitzvah for all time. Rather, the concept of Toivelling is something that was instituted by the sages, and they had a reference to this in the Torah. So there are different types of mitzvahs. There are some mitzvahs that are stated clearly in the Torah. There are other mitzvahs that were instituted by the sages, and then there's somewhat of a hybrid. There are mitzvahs that were instituted by the sages, but they are alluded to in the verse, and this would be one of those. Now, even though it's a mitzvah that was instituted by the sages, one still is allowed to make a bracha. Thank you, Hashem, for giving us this mitzvah, because Hashem gave us a mitzvah that we should do whatever the sages tell us to do. When we say sages, we don't mean anybody that got a PhD. We mean, classically, we'd be referring to the sages of the times of like Mordechai and the story of Purim. These were sages that had a high level of divine prophecy or divine influence, and they were able to institute new mitzvahs. And one of these mitzvahs was the mitzvah to Toivel Kalim. And since Hashem says we should listen to the sages, and the sages said it's a mitzvah, so we're actually able to thank Hashem for giving us this mitzvah. So that is the basics. Now getting into a little more detail. Since the utensils must be immersed only in a place that is valid for a meeting as a kosher mikveh, some place where a woman would be able to go to mikveh if she needed, therefore care must be taken not to immerse them in rivers. This is quite interesting. When they are fuller than usual from abundant rains and melting snow. This occurs very frequently before Pesach when the rivers rise, and still people use them to immerse utensils, and this is not proper. So as far as what constitutes a kosher mikveh, so there's two possibilities. Either it needs to be rainwater, which is contained in a place where the water cannot leave, and there's no leaks, which is why part of the big expense of building a mikveh is that they pour the cement in a unique way that there's no possibility that the water would leak out. Because if there are any leaks in the mikveh actually becomes not kosher since it's rainwater. Now, based on that, a river would obviously not be kosher because the water's not staying still, it's running off. However, there's a second type of mikveh which is also kosher, and that's if it's a spring. If there's a spring, a wellspring that's coming from under the ground, then even if it's flowing, it's still kosher. Now, what the Kitzur over here is saying, which is quite interesting, is that before Pesach, many people have new dishes, right? They want to get special Pesach dishes, and then they want to toivel it, so they go down to the river, right? You're living in some, wherever it is, and there's a river nearby. It's a natural river. It comes from a spring, so let me go ahead and I'll just dip it in the river. But if it's right after the rainy seasons, then it turns out that the majority of the water in that river is actually not spring water, it's rainwater, which makes it halachically different because rainwater needs to be contained with no leaks. Spring water can even be flowing. So, I mean, under very practical terms, before you go and toivel your dishes in a river, you would have to consult with a halachic authority to determine whether that river qualifies for a mikveh or not. The ocean does qualify for a mikveh, that's it. Moving along. Okay. Wooden utensils don't require immersion, but if they have metal hoops, they should be immersed, but without a bracha. Similarly, earthenware need not be immersed, but if they are plated on the inside with lead, like glazed, then they must be immersed, but without reciting a bracha. The same law applies to porcelain vessels. This gets quite complicated, especially since a lot of glasses today are glazed. In other words, this would kind of be like a raw piece of pottery that was never glazed. So practically speaking, we pretty much put everything in the mikveh unless it is disposable or plastic. Since plastic isn't mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, so most halachic authorities say that it does not need to be toiveled. It does not need to go to the mikveh. If an old utensil was used by a non-Jew in such a manner that it required kashering, meaning you'd have to put it, for example, in boiling water, or you'd have to make it red hot by using like if it was, let's say, a frying pan, where you'd actually have to blowtorch it or put it directly on the fire. So again, you would need to, in addition to kashering it, you'll also need to toivel it. Same law. Oh, sorry about that. So first you would kasher it. First you want to get rid of the actual non-kosher taste. And once you've done that, you can move on to step 2, which is to dip it in the mikveh. What happens if you borrow or rent a utensil from a non-Jew? So then you don't need to toivel it. As I've said, this requirement of toiveling dishes is only if it comes under the ownership of a Jew. But if you're just borrowing it or renting it from a non-Jew, then it does not need to be toiveled. Quite an interesting one. But if it was from a Jew, then you would need to toivel them, but without making a bracha because it's not yours. And then if you're a merchant and you're selling it to a second purchaser, so you could tell them that they don't need to toivel it because this dish has already been toiveled. There's actually a bit of debate about that. Once it goes under new ownership, would it need to be toiveled again? But the general approach is that it doesn't require that to be. So here's an interesting story. It was a little bit after we got married, and we were living in New York in Crown Heights, and we were making a cholent for the very first time. And so Erev Shabbos, I went down to the local store that sells these things, kitchen material, and I bought a nice crock pot for cholent. And then I realized I forgot to toivel it, and I was getting close to Shabbos, and I wanted to be able to, maybe we'd already cooked the cholent my wife maybe had already cooked the cholent in a pot, and now we wanted to use the crock pot. But I wouldn't have enough time to go and put it in the mikveh. So we'll see in a moment that under pressing circumstances, you can actually sell the dish to a non-Jew, and then ask him if you could borrow it from him. So then it's not owned by a Jew. If it's not owned by a Jew, it doesn't need to be toiveled. This is not something you're supposed to do at the outset, but under pressing circumstances, it's something that you could do. And that's what I did. I knocked on my neighbor's door, and the lady came to the door, never really spoken to her before. And I said, I have a really interesting favor for you. Can I give you something of mine, and it's yours? You could do whatever you want with it. And once it's yours, I'm going to ask you if you mind lending it to me. So anyhow, she couldn't really quite understand. I don't blame her. But that's what happened. I said, here, this is yours. I don't need to ever see it again. You don't need to give it back to me. But if you're so kind enough to now want to lend it to me, then I'll be so happy. And so it was. She said, yes, you're welcome to use my newly acquired dish. And that was that. Now, you're not supposed to do this on a regular basis. So after Shabbos, I wanted to regain ownership of this and then take it to the mikveh. And I knocked on the door again, whenever it was, on Sunday morning. And I said, remember the dish that I gave you? So would you perhaps consider giving it back to me? And anyhow, I didn't get that far because her husband answered the door and he said, what are you bothering us for? And he was not the most friendly of neighbors, and he closed the door and we never spoke to him again. So my dish kind of just remained theirs, and I'm not sure what I did at the end. But this is something that could be done in pressing circumstances. Let's take a look at that inside. So if you're borrowing it from a non-Jew, you do not need to toivel it. If a factory that manufactures glass utensils is owned by a Jew, but the workers are not Jewish, then the vessel still will need to go to mikveh, but without a bracha. So this is very practical in Israel. In Israel, if you're buying a set of plates or cups, and it comes from a Jewish company, then seemingly you would not need to toivel it. However, if the factory is run by non-Jews, which is often the case, often you'll have Arabs that are actually running the production line, then it would need to go to mikveh. So practically speaking, part of this is an interesting one. When you talk about kosher certification, part of kosher certification that a company can get could be not a food company, but if it's a company that produces eating utensils, then they would actually be able to get a rabbi to certify, to inspect and do random inspections to certify that the way that these dishes are being produced is in such a way that they would not need to be go to mikveh, which would obviously be a convenience for the buyer. If he sees that this rabbi certifies that it was all handled by Jews, then he would not need to put in the mikveh. If a Jew gave silver or I see it's 5:20. Please God, tomorrow we will conclude the laws of Toivelling and move on to the laws of, that's going to be a fascinating one. The idea of food that is cooked or baked by a non-Jew, which is again very relevant. But stay tuned tomorrow for more about Toivelling, and please God, on Wednesday we will learn about food being cooked by Jews and non-Jews. Thanks so much for joining and wishing you a wonderful evening.